Sure.
All right, I guess I don't have to yell. All right, good morning, everyone. This is Jeff Klausner in Southern California at UCLA. I am your moderator for today's session. Welcome, everyone, to the monthly GloCal Career Development Series. Hope you all are getting through this COVID-19 season. Certainly unprecedented times in the United States and Europe, and I'm sure where you are as well. I am, concerned about. There's certainly been a lot of fear and panic. Bottom line, like all infectious disease outbreaks, respiratory viruses, cases go up and cases go down. So as an epidemiologist, I've been leading my team to study the different outbreaks in the different cities and areas around the world. And the consistent pattern is that, several weeks, sometimes, 4 weeks, cases peak and then they go down. And there's also seemingly an absence of generalized spread. So this is actually quite different than influenza. And you really have to be careful what you read in the media. There's a lot, even in good journalistic sources, New York Times, etc. And you really got to look at the literature. But that is not our topic of discussion today. We are extremely pleased to have a recent GloCal Fellow, successful graduate of the NIH GloCal training program, Jennifer Syverson, who is an assistant professor and a medical anthropologist at University of California, Riverside in the Department of Anthropology. She works on a range of different streams of research that converge to address global health inequities. And she has focused her work on epidemics, access to healthcare, subjectivity, which maybe we'll hear a little bit more about, and methods of collaboration. She's currently at the Center for Health Disparities Research, University of California, Riverside. So without further ado, please welcome Jennifer.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. I'm so happy to be here. I'm really excited to have this opportunity to speak with you all. So as he said, I am actually a former GloCal Fellow. So let's see if I can figure out how to advance my slides. There we go. So I wanted to talk to you all a little bit about that, to start off a little bit with my background and training, and then talk about my research in Kenya as part of the GloCal program, and talk about things that maybe sometimes we don't always talk about, including what happens when you get unexpected results. I wanted to talk a little bit about the dissemination process and how I've learned just how vital this process is to our research, and talk a little bit about subsequent work and what's happened with this research since the GloCal Fellowship ended. I also want to spend some time talking about tenure track positions. And so balancing starting a new job and all of the responsibilities with teaching and research and students and everything that comes with that, and how to balance that with keeping your research agenda going, especially when you work halfway across the world and you teach in one place, do research in another place. So I will spend some time talking about that and kind of reflecting on that and offering some advice. And then I'll open it up for some final thoughts and some discussion. So very briefly, my academic training, I have my master's in public health with a focus in epidemiology. My PhD is in applied anthropology with a focus in biocultural medical anthropology. So applied anthropology, I think, dovetails very nicely with public health. So public health is this very action-oriented kind of discipline. So we like to generate knowledge and then actually apply that knowledge in order to solve real global health problems. And so applied anthropology is practiced in those same lines. And so this is generating knowledge about the social and cultural context, understanding history and politics, and using this information to solve real world problems. I did my dissertation and postdoctoral research affiliated with UC San Diego in the Division of Global Public Health. So I worked in Tijuana, Mexico, and that's where I was at UCSD as a postdoctoral fellow when I applied for the GloCal program. And so at that point, my experience was in Mexico doing HIV research. I had always wanted to work in a sub-Saharan African setting where the HIV prevalence is extremely high. And so that's when I applied for the GloCal Fellowship in order to have that opportunity. At the same time, I was applying during my postdoc for tenure track faculty positions. And so it was at that time that I saw a job posting at Ohio State University. And I had never been to Ohio. I knew nothing about Ohio State, just that it was a very large school, and I had heard that they had a football program, and that was about it. But in looking at this job ad, it was like it was written for me. And so I knew that that was a really good fit. They were looking for somebody who had an epidemiology background and an anthropology background who had done ethnographic research. Their areas of interest were infectious disease, addictions. So all of these areas that I had studied. And so I figured that that was a really good fit, that I could talk about my own personal experiences and apply for this job. And so actually what happened is that I got the GloCal Fellowship and I was offered that tenure track position at OSU at the same time. And so I was able to negotiate between both, which was exciting and stressful. I was able to negotiate to start my research with the GloCal program in Kenya. And so I went there for a period of time, came back to Ohio State to then teach for a semester. And then I went back to Kenya that next summer to finish up the research. So I can talk a little bit about that later on in the program. Very quickly, these are images from my work in the Mexico-US border, and there is a link at the bottom. This is a photo blog that we posted. We published a paper in the American Journal of Public Health, and they let you publish interviews that kind of gives the backstory of your work. And so with this particular blog that we put together, it has a lot of photos. It tells the story of the project that I worked on. And so this was really my first time of working in a large interdisciplinary group. And this is Dr. Stephanie Strathy's group at UCSD. So she is one of the co-directors of the program. And so I learned so much from her. I learned so much from the other teammates. We had an anthropologist as part of the team as well. And so he trained us and he led the qualitative component of this large study. And so this was a study looking at HIV and STI risk among female sex workers and their intimate non-commercial partners in the Mexico border area. And so I worked as part of this study and also did my dissertation research with this. So we have a lot of papers that have been published that I'm happy to share. I'm also happy to share that I am just finishing up a book about this project, and I plan to submit that soon. So this was my GloCal Fellowship information. I went to Kisumu in Western Kenya. And my project was called Emergent Injection Drug Use and HIV Risk in Nyanza, Kenya. So Nyanza is that region in Western Kenya. I had a team of outstanding mentors from UCSD, UCSF, and within Kenya. And so my project was a great example of developing research that was really based on the local needs of the organization that I worked with in Kenya. So I partnered with KEMRI and Impact Research and Development Organization. And so Dr. Kawango Agot, who was one of my mentors, is the director of this organization. And when we were talking about the possibilities for the GloCal, she said, you know, we do all this HIV prevention work with key populations, so people who are at very high risk of HIV. And we just started this program for people who inject drugs. But this is brand new. We don't know much about this population, what their needs are, what kinds of services we need to offer. And so is this something that you would be interested in working on? And so because I had just done that work in Mexico and many of the couples we worked with injected drugs, I thought that's perfect, right? So I just studied this, you know, I thought I was a new PhD and I thought, oh, you know, I have expertise in this, right? So of course I learned it looks totally different in this area of the world. And so I'll talk a little bit about that. But it was a really great partnership that we created. And so this was an interdisciplinary project that I felt really reflected the needs of the organization. And in the bottom right-hand corner, that is Grace Rota. She was one of my research assistants who was really instrumental in making this project happen. And so I've continued to collaborate with her, collaborate with Dr. Kawango and the other folks that I've worked with since the beginning. These are some photos from Kisumu, and so it's a very much a lake-based economy and a rapidly growing area of Kenya, but still a lot of rural, very beautiful areas outside of the actual city. In the bottom right-hand corner, that was an opportunity that I had to meet Obama's grandma, who lives in that region of Kenya. And so traveling and really getting to know the local place, the food, the culture, the language was a really important part of the GloCal experience. But Kisumu is a rapidly changing place. And so now that I've been working there for almost the past 7 years, having that ethnographic involvement in this place, I've really been able to see the changes that are happening. And so on the left side, we see sort of these more, you know, quote unquote, traditional kinds of scenes of the lake economy. In the middle photos, we see, you know, there's a lot of construction going on. So new roads are being built, shopping malls, hotels. The picture at the bottom in the middle is a very fancy hotel where it's rumored that the politicians take their mistresses to spend time. And so there's all of these social and cultural and economic changes that are happening, and there's still these persistent inequalities within Kisumu, and still a very high HIV prevalence within this region. On the right side, and so we see some of the effects of this. And so there's always been a culture of alcohol use. And so there's a lot of local types of alcohols that are brewed in the rural areas and consumed. But more recently, drug use has begun to filter into Kisumu. And so that's what we wanted to study with this project. And so when I first got to Kisumu, I would actually tell people, you know, this is my project, this is what we're doing. And people would say, there's no drug use here. You know, what are you doing? And so, you know, at first I thought, like, oh no, there's been some kind of mistake, like I'm not sure if this is the right project. And so from the very beginning, it was an interesting research experience. But I briefly want to put this into context. The continent of Africa has always been part of global trade routes. And so the growing importance of Africa in global drug trafficking has been occurring over the past several decades. So at least since the 1980s, we've been seeing drug trafficking happening particularly into Eastern Africa. And this has intensified over the years as we've had the war on terror, and we've had these Balkan routes from Afghanistan and over the Balkans into Europe. We've had these routes disrupted, and so traffickers have gone around that, shipped their supplies, and so some of these supplies, of particularly heroin, have been going down to the coast of Eastern Africa, so Tanzania, Kenya, and then these supplies are shipped upward to Europe, down to South Africa. And so there's been increasing attention to this, at least since the 80s, the 90s, that people have recognized that heroin is an issue in this part of the world. And so every time we study a place and it's in the middle of a drug trafficking route, there's always some spillover of the drugs into the local economy. And so people will begin to experiment with drugs. And so we've increasingly seen this in places like Kenya and Tanzania. And folks working in global health have begun to notice this and to respond. And so that's why Dr. Kawango, she had seen that other places in Kenya were beginning to start these public health and HIV prevention programs for people who inject drugs. And so that's why we wanted to look at that in Kisumu. And so very briefly, this was a mixed method study. And so as an anthropologist, I wanted to use ethnographic methods to describe the social and cultural context of injection drug use. So this is going out and doing field work, talking to people, hanging out with folks, going out and doing outreach with impact with the organization. And then we wanted to do some more formal types of data collection. So we conducted surveys to examine injection drug practices and HIV risk behaviors. And so we were able to survey 151 people. And then we wanted to use in-depth interviews to explore people's experiences. And so we wanted to look at the context of drug use, and specifically we wanted to look at the role of mobility and migration. There's a lot of movement within Kenya, back and forth between different regions. And so we wanted to look at how this might be shaping the diffusion of injection drug use and these different practices into areas where this hasn't happened before. And so we interviewed 29 people. These are a few scenes of the ethnographic fieldwork that we conducted. And so some of this is actually from a couple years later in subsequent trips, going out with the folks from Impact. And so they would do things like going out into neighborhoods and doing cleanups and things like that. Because sometimes doing services that are engaging with people who inject drugs and sex workers and populations like this, sometimes people think, oh, why are we prioritizing these kinds of populations? Like, those behaviors are really stigmatized, it's illegal. And so going out and doing things like community cleanups and talking to folks, and it's creating a kind of goodwill. And so I would go out and do outreach and meet folks, talk to people, things like that as part of the field work, and then write up field notes. Very briefly, this are some of the sample characteristics of the folks who took part in the survey. And so just the main takeaway point that I want to emphasize here is that we really had a concerted effort to recruit females. There typically tends to be more men who use drugs compared to women, but we did want that representation of women. And so in general, these women were at high risk. And so they had less migration and really less movement throughout their lives compared to the men. They were less likely to have a regular partner, but more likely to have kids at home that they were caring for. And so often they were engaging in sex work in order to earn money to care for their families. And they were much more likely to be HIV positive compared to the men. And so we see that this disadvantage among the women is probably not surprising. And this reflects a lot of the global health research in terms of people who inject drugs. So what was surprising were the actual patterns of drug use that we documented. And so we went in with this idea we were going to find heroin use, and this is what the drug trafficking routes look like, and the little bit of literature that was available at the time was saying that it's heroin that's available in Kenya. And so basically the drug use that we documented the least amount of was heroin. So we see a lot of alcohol use, and the most common thing that folks were reporting to inject was cocaine. And so there hadn't been a lot of reports of cocaine in this part of the world. Cocaine is produced primarily in South America, and those drug trade routes look very different. And so this was a very curious finding in that not very many people were saying that they used heroin. And so I remember one of my mentors at the time said, you know, I don't know if you can trust any of your data that you collected for your survey. And so I was thinking, oh no, you know, what is going on here? Is this going to be a disaster? I mean, am I going to be able to publish anything on this? And, you know, I had my tenure track job at OSU that I was going back to. And you know, I was thinking, what are they going to think of this? And so this really became a puzzle to begin to unravel. And so I talked to a lot of experts. We went to the qualitative data, and so we were looking at the context of injection drug use and how this evolved over time. And so people, they were exposed to injection drug use outside of Kisumu. So we did see a lot of migration and mobility and getting connected to people who were using drugs, drug supplies elsewhere in Kenya. We've seen a lot more drug use along the coast and in a big city like Nairobi. And so that's what was happening, that people were learning about drug use. And this was something that was very new and that was novel in the area of Kisumu. And so people wanted to try it because they were stressed. They felt like they were idle. If they weren't working, they were bored. They wanted morale, they wanted to feel good, experience, you know, what it was like to use drugs. They're curious, they hear from their peers about it. And so some of these quotes are speaking to some of these issues, right? So people who feel like, well, they have much bigger problems than the drugs, and so using drugs sort of make those problems go away, at least temporarily. And so we also found that people were calling it cocaine. People were reporting a variety of effects from the drugs. And so it was a very different pattern of drug use than we had seen in places like Tijuana, where people consistently use heroin. They wake up, they need to use it first thing. They're injecting multiple times a day. There's a steady supply. It's pretty straightforward compared to this context where everything's new. People don't have a lot of information about what they're using, what the effects are. And so it was this kind of chaotic kind of context in which people were maybe not able to access drugs all the time. And so they were mixing it with drinking alcohol and then using drugs when they could, and sort of reporting all of this polydrug and alcohol use and these different kinds of effects from the drugs, and calling it all these different names like cocaine, but also a lot of different kinds of slang names as well, because they were trying to keep these patterns of drug use very secretive. And so what we think was happening is that this was just a really new phenomenon in this area. And so in looking at some of the other research, when heroin first appeared on the coast in Kenya years ago, and this was back in the 1990s, the same thing had happened where people were calling it cocaine because it was a white powder and it looked like cocaine. And so people were calling it cocaine and all of these other kinds of names. And people were really learning about, what is this? How do you use it? What does it do? And so years later, we're seeing this as the movement of drugs and this information, this knowledge is shifting into new contexts. Again, we're seeing the same thing. So I don't think it was cocaine. I think it was local conceptions of drugs that they were using. And so whatever it was that they were using, whatever they called it, we did document that there was injection drug use in this area and that there were a number of high-risk behaviors that really spoke to the possibility of amplifying HIV transmission in this area. And so dissemination was a really critical part of this research, as it is with all research. And so in terms of dissemination, we need to think about the different audiences that we want to reach. So there's that applied local kind of audience that we want to reach. And then we have to think about our academic careers as well and the academic audiences. And so this is an example of disseminating the results from this study back to Impact Research and Development Organization, and talking to the folks who worked there about what we were finding. And so what was that going to mean in terms of the services that they were going to offer? And so every time that I do dissemination presentations and things like that, I really want to make it a collaborative process. So make it interactive. I involve my research assistants. They help me with analyzing the data and putting together the presentation. They co-present with me. And so particularly in presenting results back to communities, I like to make this a very interactive, more of a discussion to really think about what are the next steps, what are the implications of this research. And so we had a lot of different forums where we shared our research within Kenya that turned out to be really important. So in the top right-hand corner, that's Grace, who is helping me to disseminate results of a study later on. And so we presented, there's local KEMRI CDC meetings that happen in Kisumu every week. And so we presented an overview of our results there several times. A stakeholders meeting in Nairobi that turned out to be very important, that I'll go back to in a moment. Other kinds of local meetings as well. There's an annual meeting that happens in Nairobi that's all around HIV and STIs. And so that's a really important local event. And other things as well that happened in Kisumu. And then there's the global conferences. And so these are the academic conferences. These are the things that we need to be also thinking about in terms of being competitive for a tenure track job, or once you have that job, being able to show that you're productive, you're getting your research out there, particularly in international kinds of events. So I presented this at a drug conference in Belgium. I went to the International AIDS Conference when it was held in Durban, South Africa. And I was really fortunate in that conference in that there was a panel about key populations and people were talking about drug use. And one of the panel members was at the last minute unable to attend. And so I was able to fill that slot and actually give an oral presentation at the International AIDS Conference with experts who were working all over the continent of Africa and talking about this emerging phenomenon of drug use in this region. And so that was a really exciting experience. And then for my own disciplinary expectations, I've presented the results at a variety of anthropology conferences. And so this is an example of one of the slides that I have presented. And I remember specifically that this was part of my presentation to the local CDC weekly meeting that they held in Kisumu. And so we really wanted to bring in the voices of the people who inject drugs so that they could share their perspectives. And so we had asked them questions about what kinds of services do you need? What kinds of things do we need to set up in Kisumu in order to really look at this issue and engage in HIV prevention? And so these are some of the quotes. And so from Jacob, if you can't help us, then that means everything, including this town, will go down with young men who are resourceful. And their resource goes to waste because of drug injection. How can you people help us, right? So he was turning the question back on us, like, this is here, what are you going to do about it? And so we had a discussion in this local meeting, and I remember one of the CDC folks came up to me afterwards, and he said, I just can't get Jacob's quote out of my head, right? I can't stop thinking about this. And so I think that speaks to the power of sharing these kinds of results, sharing the quotes and the voices of the people with whom we're working, and this can be a really powerful way to enact change. And so one of my most proud accomplishments from the GloCal was actually that we were able to really enact this kind of change. And so one of my colleagues from Impact was able to give a presentation at a national meeting with policymakers, so people from the Ministry of Health, from different NGOs, from different organizations all around Kenya were talking about the issue of drug use. And so he was able to present our research from Kisumu. And afterwards, somebody who was working at an NGO in partnership with the ministry, they were beginning to do needle and syringe exchange services. And so she came up to him afterwards and said, we had no idea that this was happening in a place like Kisumu. So we want to actually fund and start those services. And so this research actually helped secure the funding for the first syringe services program in Western Kenya. And so this is really that on the ground kind of impact that we're looking for in global health work. And the increasing recognition of drug use has also led to other kinds of services like MAT. So that's medication-assisted therapy, which in this context is methadone. And so these are some of the papers that we have published in the upper left-hand corner. These are some of the results from our work, epidemiological papers, and also ethnographic papers too, that were talking about these issues of how this is an emergent and kind of chaotic market, and people were talking about cocaine. And I remember for that paper, some of the reviewers were really, really mean to me on that paper because I was reporting that people were saying they were using cocaine, and they told me that can't possibly be true. Why are you listening to them? Right? And then it becomes a question of, well, why shouldn't we listen to our participants, right? Let's figure out what that means. And so that paper is sort of grappling with these different kinds of issues. Our work in the top right-hand corner, we were also interviewed by the local Kenyan media. So they did a story about Kisumu and the work that we were doing. And so we were interviewed for a newspaper article. And our work has been picked up in other venues as well. So this was a comment in the Lancet Infectious Disease talking about how HIV is such an issue, and yet we continue to neglect people who use drugs, and heroin is reaching these places where it's been previously untouched, like Kisumu. And so they cited our work and said we really need to be thinking about these kinds of issues in HIV prevention. And so briefly going back to the on-the-ground kind of results, we have our academic venues, we have our on-the-ground kind of results, and I just wanted to comment on what's happened since in this research. And just think about how, one, there can kind of be a disconnect here, depending on what's valued in your position, right? So if you're going for the tenure track position, if you already have that job secured, maybe these kinds of applied programs aren't looked upon in the same way as your academic publications, right? And so really thinking about what's valued in your department and what you get credit for in terms of putting together your file is something important. And so I always talk about these on the ground kind of results, but really it's papers and presentations that are looked at in a different kind of way, which can sometimes be a little bit frustrating. And the other thing I wanted to comment on is that these kinds of services can be informed by our research, but they're also shaped by other kinds of broader factors. And so in global health work, we see this model of governance, and where Western governments, donors, funnel money through ministries of health and NGOs to do these work and these different projects. And these priorities can be set elsewhere, right? So we may have some impact on the local work, but there's also these broader kinds of priorities that are set in corridors of power that may be in Atlanta, Washington, DC, Geneva. And so right after we did this work, Impact was reorganized by their funders, and the funders said, well, you're no longer going to be funded to work in Kisumu. You're going to be working in these other counties outside of Kisumu instead. And so all this work that they had done to put together the MAT Center and to start the syringe services and work on this research and really had the expertise in this area, suddenly they were pulled from this area and another NGO was put in their place to take over. And so that NGO was lovely, but they just didn't have any experience with this. And so I remember sitting in the office with Dr. Kawango, and she said, no, not my PWIDs, right? So people who inject drugs are PWIDs, the acronym, right? And she said, no, don't take those away from me. And it was this moment of kind of feeling a little bit deflated in the work. And so they've since gone on to do other kinds of work. But it reminds me of how important it is to think about global health work in terms of how we do our work, what's considered important and by whom, and the different power structures that enable us to do our work. So this might be called a critical global health, right? That we're looking at these different kinds of power relations. And so this reminds me of this TV show. So it's a mockumentary instead of a documentary. A couple of episodes were produced in Kenya by Kenyans. And so this agency was called the Samaritans, and their agency was called Aid for Aid. And basically it was poking fun at these NGOs and at this foreign donor kind of culture that happens in places like Kenya within global health. And so this agency on this TV show, right, it's run by this white guy with an MBA who has no real experience. And so in this episode, they're strategizing about a grant application, and they're not actually talking about the content of their project. He actually gives them Scrabble pieces that have the letters on it. So he gives everybody the Scrabble pieces and says, come up with an acronym, right? Everybody knows it's all about the acronym to get funding. And so it's really, it's the Kenyans poking fun at these power structures of how global health operates, right, in these different places. And so I think it shows the brilliance of the Kenyans who are making a social commentary on this, right? And seeing through my work in Kenya, I can see how this happens. And so my work is really—
Hey, Jennifer, I'm going to give you a 10-minute warning, Jennifer, and I want you to transition to the academic career development piece and also give people time for some interaction and questions. And we're going to have a hard stop at 8:30.
Okay, sounds great. Right. And so some of my more recent research, I'm happy to share these slides. I have continued to work in Kenya over the years and keep building those relationships. And so I did want to talk about some of the challenges that come with this over time. And so as I had said before that I had negotiated, so I had accepted the tenure track job at Ohio State. And so I went to Kenya, I came back to OSU, and I started in the middle of January, and it was in a polar vortex. It was 35 degrees below zero, and my first day of school was canceled, right? And so I was thinking, you know, where am I? What have I gotten myself into, right? But you know, we apply for these kinds of jobs, and the advice that I would have for applying for these jobs is really looking at the fit of the position. And so you're looking at your fit in terms of your training, your skills, your research experience, and what they're looking for in the position, right? And so you can be a brilliant scholar and just maybe you don't fit in with the vision that the department has for itself, right? And so you shouldn't take any of that personally. It's really looking at how can you fit in, how can you work with the other folks in your department and look at the bigger mission of that department and of the university to see how you can be supported in your work and how you can find colleagues to work with. So I was at Ohio State for 3.5 years. And so they treated me very well. They were very good to me. I had funding to keep up my research in Kenya through a variety of funding mechanisms. But in terms of fit, we also have to think about our own personal fit, right? So our life and are we happy with where we're at? And so I had wanted to come back to California for a number of personal and professional reasons. So in those first couple of years, I kept my options open, applied for a few positions, applied at UCR, because again, they were looking for a medical anthropologist. They were looking for somebody who was within my area of research. And so it was a good academic fit, but I also felt it was a good personal fit to come back to Southern California to recultivate some of the academic relationships and collaborations of people that I have known in this area. And so to really, you know, look at those professional and personal reasons for transitioning. And so if you are, once you do get that job, and if you do consider moving elsewhere, you know, maybe that first position isn't your ideal position, you're always able to leverage that, right? And so keeping your options open, but looking for what else might be a better fit for you. But thinking about how that transition can be challenging, right? So you have to move, you have to readjust, you have to reestablish yourself. And so all of those things should be taken into consideration when you're applying for jobs or when you're looking to make that shift into a different kind of position, right? So you're looking at the fit for the department, but you're also looking at the fit for your own life and your research, your well-being, your happiness. So that would be my advice in terms of thinking about jobs. And I've been very happy to come back to the UC system and so getting involved in these different kinds of issues, getting involved in the Center for Health Disparities Research at UCR. So this is a brand new NIH funded center that we're working on collaborative interdisciplinary research. And so being a part of the community engagement and dissemination core is really looking back to some of the lessons that I've learned through my work in Kenya. And so I do want to wrap up in order to give time for questions. And so I know that that was a whirlwind of career. But I think as my final thoughts that your research, you know, your GloCal Fellowship, your research for the rest of your lives, right? It's not always going to work out exactly as we planned, but that's okay. And we can learn from the unexpected. The importance of community engagement and relationship building over time is key. So I have maintained the relationships that I've had in Kenya since my very first trip there. The importance of disseminating your work, and again, thinking about to those multiple audiences. So the on-the-ground kind of applied results and the kind of academic presentations that we need to make as well in order to be in conversation with our peers and to remain competitive in our academic jobs. And also to think about this idea of critical global health, which doesn't mean we just criticize everything, but we really think about power relations and how we build different kinds of relationships and address the different kinds of health inequities that we see in our work. And so I have a lot of people to thank, my mentors, participants, the funding all along the way. And I do want to open it up for questions. And thank you very much for your attention.
All right, let's get some questions going, folks. I don't see the chat box here, but if someone does, let's put up some questions through that. Or while we wait for do that, does anyone have any questions? They want to unmute and ask a question?
Hi there. I have a question.
Please, go ahead.
Yeah. Hi, my name is Chimtai. Thank you. It was a really great presentation. And thank you for kind of being deliberate in talking about kind of partnering with locals and, you know, doing the, returning the research back to communities and kind of having those presentations, because I think a lot of academics sometimes we forget that. How was doing work on drug use in among HIV positive folks in Western Kenya? How did that kind of match up to your academic position at OSU? As far as it seems like it's pretty far population. Like, were you also working locally, or like how did you? Was there a global health community at that university, and how did you kind of marry these two interests? So I think that sometimes is an issue, especially with folks in the West, as far as finding academic homes where global health is kind of within the agenda of the university.
Yeah, thank you. That's a really good question. So for me, the topic and the geographic location of my research wasn't a problem, particularly in an anthropology department. People work all over the world, and I think that that's true in global health and a lot of colleges of public health and things. So I think for my department, they were specifically interested in people who were working on issues related to infectious disease. And so HIV, addictions, those were keywords that were actually advertised in their job ad. And so that's what attracted me to that position, is that I felt like it was written exactly for the kinds of work that I was doing. And so I think that speaks back to the importance of fit for the department. And so if departments are really interested in certain types of topics, they feel like they want to have that expertise covered, and you're able to speak to that expertise. I don't think the topic of the research can be, is problematic. I think it can be really beneficial if you're doing global health work, if you're working in a specific area for a long time, you're building relationships there. I think more and more universities are valuing that. If you have a long-term partnership in another area of the world, I mean, that's somewhere that you can involve students in training, and those are things that you can highlight in your job application too. I'm working in this place, I'm building these relationships, I would love to bring students here to help me with the research, I have these plans for these other kinds of projects. And so then depending on what kind of academic schedule you're on, you might be confined to just traveling during the summer when you're not teaching. But you can get a lot done if you travel over the summer, really maximize your time and just, I do Zoom calls with my team in Kenya. So every Thursday morning at 6 a.m., we're on a Zoom call to check in, and then I go there every summer, relationships going. So I hope that answered your question.
Yeah, that answers my question. Thank you.
You're welcome.
We have a couple of questions in the chat box. So the first one is from Pablo. He says hello, and his first question is, did you tell anyone at Ohio about your job search? And his second question is, was it hard to transition funding from Ohio to UCR?
Those are great questions. So there's not a straightforward answer, I would say, about telling the folks at Ohio that I was on the job market. So for me personally, I didn't say anything to them when I was just applying for jobs. I didn't say anything until I had actually interviewed and was offered the job. And so I was able to get away and do the campus visit. It was a one-day complete whirlwind. And so I was able to get away and do that. And I felt like I didn't want to say anything until I actually had an offer, because you never know what's going to happen. So then at that point, I had the offer and presented it to OSU. And there was some back and forth negotiation, because the university you're currently at can counteroffer with you. And so you might want to consider, maybe you end up wanting to stay. And so a lot of people apply for other jobs and try to leverage that in order to get a better salary or better benefits and things like that. And so for me, I told them once I got the offer, but I ultimately decided to leave to UCR. And so the transition of funding is possible. Schools can do that. I was actually at a point where I was ending my funding from one project. And so I had to travel really quickly to Kenya and wrap everything up by the grant period by June 30th.
If you can, please.
I was able to finish up, and then I didn't have any funds to transition over. So I know it can be messy, but it's definitely possible to transfer your funds, especially if you have a big NIH grant at the time.
Okay, thank you. Another question from Vania. I appreciate your commentary on critical global health. What are some ways that you employ to equalize the power differences that often occur between US Western-based researchers versus local researchers?
Thank you for that question. That's a great question, and that's what I am preoccupied with thinking about these days. And I think that's actually the direction my research is headed in. And that's what I spend a lot of time doing to try to address some of these inequities. I've really put a lot of time and thought into training my research assistants to really trying to build capacity. And so just like I teach research methods and classes here at UCR, I teach the same thing. I use the same materials to the Kenyan research assistants. And I put them in charge of data analysis. And I ask them, especially if they're the ones who are on the ground doing some of the interviews and some of the ethnographic fieldwork. I mean, they have so much knowledge, and they're so smart and capable and often not tapped into in these big projects. We have our ideas, and this is my hypothesis, and so, this is just what I'm looking at. And so we really need to take time to develop these relationships, these collaborations, to train about not only data collection, right? So not only about coming in and taking the data, but help us analyze the data. Help us think about what we need to be focusing on. Who do we need to be talking to? What are some issues that maybe you're seeing on the ground that you need to let us know so that we can be thinking about that? So a lot of my work is really trying to build that capacity. And I always kind of joke, you know, I'm sort of trying to write myself out of a job in a way, right? So that because I want local investigators to start getting grants and getting their ideas funded and things like that. And so anything that I can do to train and build capacity and really listen to local perspectives, I think is the first step in addressing some of these different power differentials.
Thanks, Jennifer. I think we have time for one last question. This is from Catherine, and she says, great and interesting work indeed. Jacob's quote also really touched me. Participants asking researchers how you are going to help us. Can you share with us what you recommended based from the results of the study to stakeholders and policymakers as ways to help this population?
Thank you for that question. That's a great question. It's complicated because people who are at high risk for HIV need a lot of things. And so we tend to think about these populations as, you know, okay, so we're just going to recommend prevention services and just all of these kinds of services that are directly related to HIV. But I think we also need to think about folks as whole people, right? So HIV, their risk, that's just one part of their lives. And so why are they at high risk of HIV? Well, they have all of these other kinds of vulnerabilities in their lives. It's socioeconomic, it's within their relationships, they're supporting families, they're experiencing hardships, you know, all of these different kinds of issues. And so our recommendations were to, yes, offer these services. So HIV prevention services, offering care for those who are positive, offering syringe services programs. And so that's access to clean injection equipment. So if people are not able to quit using drugs, at least we can keep them safe and keep them from spreading disease in the meantime until we're able to offer them treatment. And so all of those kinds of biomedical services are really vital. But we've also recommended that we need to have wraparound services, social services, economic services, other kinds of things that attend to people as a whole person, right? And so addressing some of those root causes of drug use in the first place, that I don't have a job, I feel bad about myself, I'm stressed out, I'm so worried, I don't know what to do. So
all right, Jennifer, I'm going to have to wrap this up. Your work is obviously incredibly motivating and interesting. You know, we can share your links, but people can also, you know, go on PubMed and find your work. And I am sure if work is behind a paywall, you can contact Jennifer and she can provide you the PDFs or access to those reports and manuscripts. This was certainly one of our best and most engaging presentations. I want to thank everyone for their participation today. Be well, be kind, be smart. Thank you.
thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jennifer.
And please feel free to contact me if you'd like to keep the discussion going or any publications. Thank you.